Hello, welcome. Thanks for joining me. I'm going to try to keep this short and do a quick demonstration of using Node with the Axios package to fetch some data from an API, a server API. I'm going to be using the Star Wars API because it's free and fun. And what we're going to do, time permitting, is get some data from the API and generate a Markdown file with Node, just to kind of get a little practice and take a look at using the Async Await syntax and promises working with Axios and doing a little data fetching over HTTP. So let's get started. First off, I don't have a plan, so I'm just kind of making this up as we go along. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to make a new folder. I'll be using VS Code for this. I'm just going to call this fetch, Axios swapi was what we'll call this. I'm going to go ahead and open VS Code up to this folder now. And go ahead and get started. So I'm going to first need to figure out what our Markdown is going to look like. So I think, well, first let's take a look at the data we get back from swapi. My thoughts were maybe we'll make a little fact sheet about a Star Wars character of our choosing. So we'll make a little command line tool where you enter the name of a character. Actually, we're just going to make it hard-coded for Luke Skywalker. Let's just do that. So Luke Skywalker looks like we get at people/1, so we'll grab Luke, and then we're going to go ahead and create a little fact sheet using Markdown about Luke. So we're going to go ahead and call this we'll just call it factsheet.markdown, factsheet.md. And then if we're using Luke Skywalker as an example, I think we'll just put his name up top. Skywalker facts, like so. We'll make a little heading with Markdown. If you're not familiar with Markdown, you should check it out. I will, when I have a moment, when I have the time, I'll add a link to some documentation on what Markdown is all about. But let's continue on. So we're going to put the name of the character across the top. And then we'll include height. My guess by these numbers is we're dealing with centimeters. I'm not as familiar with metrics, so I'm going to say 177 cm, 2 feet. So 5.8 feet seems a little short, to be honest. 172 even shorter, but forgive me if that's you, but I just thought Luke would be taller. 5.5 feet. So Luke, I'm going to go with centimeters, so it seems the most reasonable. So let's do that. Luke Skywalker, and then we'll have biometrics, and then we'll say something like we'll give him we'll make height bold, so we'll say height 172 cm. And this being marked down, in order to get a new line, we have to put an extra empty line in between. Mass, I'm guessing those are kilograms. 77 kg to pounds, just get an idea. Yep, seems reasonable. So we'll go with mass. Okay. His hair color. And that's gonna be blonde. We'll do eye color. We'll just call this info. And that way we can just kind of keep going, and we'll say blue. And gender, male. And let's see, I want to do one extra request, so I think what I'll do is I'll go ahead and do the home world. That way we have to do a second request to get into some promise chaining. So we're going to go ahead and do home world. And that way we have to go to another page. Oh, we want to do birth year because why not? Birth year 19BBY. Okay. And then finally, let's go get a home world. So we're going to take this request now, which looks like I need planets 1. We'll request planets 1 here. I did 1, 1. So, and we'll just get the name of the homeworld, Tatooine. And I think we'll stop right there. So there's a little fact sheet. We'll use a Markdown Preview just to see how this looks. Go ahead and open Preview. I'm using an extension to make my Markdown Preview like it would look on GitHub. So if you're interested in that extension, it is called Markdown Preview GitHub Styling. And that allows you to see what your markdowns, so like your README files, will look like when you publish them on GitHub. All right, so there's our little fact sheet on Luke Skywalker. And so let's go ahead and work on our app now that we kind of have an example of what the output's going to look like. So I'm going to add another file, index.js. Also, we're going to need some packages, so let's go ahead and run npm init, and I'm just going to take -y to take all the default options. And then we're going to be using Axios, so I'm going to go ahead and npm install Axios. So npm I Axios, we'll add that package. Great. All right. So I think we're basically going to want to write two functions because there's two phases to this app, right? We need to get data, and then once we have the data, we want to create our markdown file. So since I already have the markdown file, it might be a good idea to actually start with that. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to just copy and paste all of this. And then I'm going to go here in my file. We're going to write a little function called, let's see, render markdown. And that's going to return a markdown string. So we're going to return. And then what we can do is use a template literal in JavaScript. It's going to make this pretty easy. I can just take everything I've pasted on my clipboard and drop it in here. And then we can basically go and play fill in the blanks, kind of like a giant Mad Lib, right? So here I can replace this with height, right? So we put a $sign in curly braces, and then we can just say, we'll make this take, I guess, 2 parameters. We want our person and our homeworld parameter, since homeworld comes separate. So we're going to call render markdown with a person and a homeworld. In fact, let's just make the whole thing, we'll just call it data. And then what we'll do here is say, going back to the documentation for swapi, oops, go forward please, go back please, forward please, okay, go back to swapi. So we have the name property, so we're going to say data.name. We're going to say data.mass. Data.hair_color. Data.eye_color. And I'm figuring this out just by reading the documentation here on the right-hand side from the swapi API. All I'm looking at. Data.gender. Data.birth_year. And then finally, homeworld. How are we going to take care of homeworld? I guess we'll just make it part of data. So I'll just say data.homeworld name is what we'll call it. Perfect. Or maybe we'll just, yeah, let's not overcomplicate things. We'll just leave it like that. All right, great. Finally, yeah, I think that works pretty well. The problem is with template strings, all the white space, so the new line here, all this space to the left, all of that gets preserved in Markdown. So what I think I'm going to do is, I know it's not pretty, but we're going to go ahead and kind of make this code a bit ugly. But I feel like this is the easiest, fastest way to just make everything work. So this function returns our Markdown string. Oops, I almost forgot the name, data.name up here, and this should have been data.height right here. Glad I noticed that. Data.name. And there we go. So now we've got our render markdown function working. Let's go ahead and test it out, I suppose. No, let's not test it out. I'm feeling lazy. Let's just build. So next up, normally I would test this out, but next up we're going to build our fetch person function. And for now, we're just going to fetch Luke. So the URL to fetch Luke is this URL right here. We're going to say const URL equals people1. And then we're going to use the Axios package. So I'm going to say const Axios equals require Axios. And that's going to import the Axios package from npm, which are already installed. So that should be over here in our node modules, as we can see. And in order to do a GET request with Axios, we can just return Axios.get and then pass in our URL. And that should work out. So let's test our fetch person function. So right above it, I'm going to call fetch person, and then we're going to say .then console. That's going to get a response object, and I just want a console.log response.data to see what that looks like, and we'll add a catch in case something goes wrong to accept an error. We'll console.log the error if one occurs. All right, great. So we've got fetch person, Axios, which returns our call to Axios, meaning that I'm going to get a promise, which I can chain this .then call onto. Console log the data for now, and then catch if there's an error. Let's just test that out. So I'm going to open up my terminal by right-clicking over on the left-hand side here in the Explorer area of VS Code and choose Open an Integrated Terminal. And then I'm going to type node index to run our code and see if it works. It looks like it does, which is awesome. So this gets me the person. So I have everything, but we also want to grab the home world. So I'm going to make another function called fetch home world. Actually, yeah, fetch home world, I guess, or fetch planet, we'll call it. Fetch planet. And this takes a planet URL, and we'll go ahead and return axios.get planet URL. So it's almost like, you know what, I'm not going to make a separate function. Instead, what we're going to do is return axios.get URL. And then what are we going to do here? I think, let's back this up. So I'm not going to separate out our Axios calls. So I'm going to back this up a second, just so that way we can demonstrate promise chaining a little more clearly. So instead, I'm just going to write a function main. And that's going to do our URL to fetch the person, which then we can say axios.get URL here, and then we can say .then. So now that I have the person, so this is going to be response, and then we have our data for our person with response.data. And what I want to do is do another request. So what I could do is say axios.get And then we could take response.data.homeworld. And that's going to, then we could chain another dot then, and now I have another arrow function, which let's say we got homeworld response with it. So I'll call it homeworld res to differentiate it from our person res. And then I could call, and then I could say const homeworld name equals homeworld res dot data dot name, like so. And then I could finally call our render markdown function. So const md, and we'll call render markdown, and that I could take my person. So let's go ahead and make const data equal response.data, right? That's our person data. We'll call it person data equals response.data. And then we want to add to that. So we're going to say person data dot homeworld name equals homeworld res dot response dot name, and that would be the name of the homeworld. And then we could just pass in person data, and then console.log the markdown. And let's go ahead and run that code now. Uh-oh, I forgot to call main. Got to call main, otherwise nothing's going to happen. All right, let's give this a shot. And it looks like we had an error. So let's add some error handling. So my outer dot then needs a dot catch. By the way, we're going to change this because this is not really getting any benefit from promises. We're kind of going into a little callback hell here. But let's go ahead and take an error here, and we'll console.log the error. And then we need to do the same for the inner promise. So dot catch here as well with an error and console.log error. Have an extra semicolon there to get rid of. Format our code. Here, let's just say homeworld name equals homeworld name, like so. Okay, let's try this one out for size. Okay, now it's working. Sometimes the swapi API, I've noticed, does that. So looks like we're getting everything, including the name of the homeworld, which is pretty awesome. But our code's kind of a mess right now. We're not really using promises the way they are meant to be used. So if we want to be able to flatten this out and chain these promises, what we should do in our dot then here is return our second call to Axios dot get, like so. But there's a little issue because I need to get my person data as well as the homeworld data. I'm going to need to lift those up. So we're going to say let person data right here. And then when we get our first response, I'm going to say person data equals response.data right here. And now that I'm returning my Axios.get, I can take everything I had originally put in this .get, and we can chain that to the outer promise. See how that cleans things up? And now we get the homeworld name, and we don't want to do person data anymore here. We just want to add homeworld name to our person data, which we lifted up a level. And then once we have that, we can render our markdown and then console log it. So that gets us out of our callback hell situation by making sure that as soon as we hit another promise that we needed to wait for, pardon me, my headset cut out there, but as soon as we hit the second promise that we needed to wait for, we can just return that promise and then chain another dot then on, and that keeps us from creating that callback hell situation. It allows us to have a nice linear, easier to read flow in our code, and that's the whole point of promises really, is they just make the code easier to read. And now because I have these chained, I don't need two dot catches. I mean, I can leave that if I needed some special handling for homeworld, but I can, instead of instead of putting two dot catches now, this one will catch if the first dot then fails or the second dot then fails. Either one will skip down to my dot catch. So let's test this code. I'm going to run it one more time down on my terminal here. And we can see that it worked, which is pretty awesome. So finally, let's go ahead and get the file system utility. So we're going to say const fs equals require fs. We're going to use the file system package. And we're going to continue working with promises. So I'm going to bring in a utility, the util package for Node, because that has a utility that can convert something that uses a typical callback signature. So it takes a function that accepts a callback as the last parameter, and then it can convert that into a promise for us. So I'm going to grab util, and we're going to make our own custom const write file async function that returns a promise. And we can use util.promisify, and then pass it fs.writefile. And that's going to create a promisified version of writefile, which is pretty awesome. So finally, after render markdown, I can return again, because this returns a promise now. Instead of console logging the markdown, I'm going to return writefile async, and we're going to call this factsheet.md is the name of the file, and md is the content, right? The markdown that we got from calling render markdown. And now that that's chained, I can add another dot then, and that can print some kind of success message. So I'll just console.log created factsheet.md. All right, so let's try that one more time. Gonna run, and it says created factsheet.md, and if we go look, we've got our fact sheet. And just to verify that, let's delete fact sheet. By running our code again, should create fact sheet, and there it is. Voila. Now we could enhance this maybe by letting the user enter the ID of the character they want, or we could even put a list of character names and maybe use a package like Inquirer to map whatever name the user chose to an ID. We could add some extra enhancements. I will leave that to you because I am running out of time. I wanted to show one more thing. So here we're using a chain series of promises. What about using the async await syntax instead? So we're going to rewrite this main function to use async await. So to begin doing that, first thing we need to do is put the async keyword in front of our function. And now we can start rewriting these chain promises to use async await instead. So I'm just going to comment that out for now. And what we're going to do is say we're going to start with const person data equals. Actually, we're going to make a generic variable. Let's say let data, and then we're going to say await axios.get URL. And that's actually not going to get me data. That's going to get me a response. So if I want data, we're just going to say response. We're going to reuse response. And now I can say const person data equals response.data, like so. And then now we want to get the home world info. So I'm going to let response equal await axios.get person data.homeworld has the URL that we got back for the person's homeworld, right? Or sticking with what we did before, let's use response.data.homeworld. And now we can get, we can say person data.homeworld name equals response.data.name, which is what we did before to get the name of the homeworld. So we got our person data. Let's create some visual separation here. So we create our person data, we add the homeworld name to it. And then finally, let's await writefile async. And then we'll grab our arguments to writefile async that we used before. So I almost forgot to render the markdown. So we'll say const md equals render markdown, and we'll pass in person data. And then finally, we want to log our success message once that's done. So we'll go ahead and put that message here. Now, what about errors? So when we use async await, instead of the .then .catch syntax of promises, what we need to do is create a try catch block. So I'm just going to wrap all my code in a try catch block. And so basically the success path is inside our try block, and then in our catch block, we'll just console log.error. And if at any point one of these promises rejects or we have any errors in our code, execution will stop and immediately jump down to the catch block and run our catch block. So that's how you can convert our promise chain into the async await syntax. Let's make sure our code works. I'm going to delete our fact sheet file. If I do ls, we can see there's no fact sheet. And now I can run node index, and it should generate our fact sheet markdown file. And now if we do an ls, we can see there's factsheet.markdown. If I open a preview, there's our Luke Skywalker facts. All right, time's up. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this helpful. Maybe it sheds a little light on different ways you can express asynchronous code in JavaScript, whether using the promise syntax or the async await syntax.